The August heat in Marietta, Georgia, pressed against the windows of Harold Mitchell's colonial home like an unwelcome visitor, thick and persistent despite the central air conditioning that had been running since dawn. At 67, Harold had grown accustomed to the rhythm of his retirement days. Coffee at 6:30 while reading the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on his tablet, light breakfast of steel-cut oats and fresh blueberries from the farmer's market, followed by tending to Margaret's rose garden that he'd maintained religiously since her passing 3 years ago. But today felt different. Today marked what would have been his and Margaret's 41st wedding anniversary. Harold stood in his kitchen, staring at the framed photograph that occupied the windowsill above the sink. Margaret, at 35, laughing at something he'd said during their vacation to Tybee Island. Her auburn hair caught the coastal sunlight, and her green eyes sparkled with the joy that had first attracted him when they met at a Georgia Tech engineering mixer in 1981. Sarah had inherited those eyes, though lately they seemed to carry a weight that reminded Harold too much of his late wife during her final months battling ovarian cancer. The doorbell's Westminster chime echoed through the house, pulling Harold from his reverie. Through the frosted glass panels, he could see Sarah's silhouette, smaller than usual, somehow diminished. When he opened the door, his daughter stood on the front porch, holding 2 paper bags from Cracker Barrel, her usual Tuesday evening routine since Margaret's funeral. "Hey, Dad," Sarah said, her voice carrying a forced brightness that didn't match the dark circles under her eyes. At 42, she'd maintained the professional polish that had made her successful in real estate, but today her usually immaculate appearance showed cracks. A wrinkled blouse, scuffed heels, and hands that trembled slightly as she juggled the food bags. "Sarah, sweetheart, you look tired." Harold stepped aside to let her enter, noting how she avoided his gaze. "Everything all right at work?" She moved through the familiar routines, unpacking containers of meatloaf, green beans, and cornbread onto the kitchen counter, while Harold retrieved plates from the oak cabinets Margaret had insisted on during their 1995 renovation. The domestic choreography felt comfortable, a weekly dance they'd perfected over 3 years of shared grief and gradual healing. "Work's been challenging," Sarah said, her back turned as she arranged their dinner. "The market's tough right now. Buyers are skittish with the interest rates, and sellers have unrealistic expectations." Harold studied his daughter's profile as she worked. Sarah had always been driven, sometimes to a fault. Even as a child, she'd approach problems with an intensity that worried him and Margaret. In high school, she'd stayed up until 3 a.m. perfecting science fair projects that were already guaranteed blue ribbons. In college, she double majored in business and communications, graduating summa cum laude while maintaining a part-time job and volunteering at the local animal shelter. That same intensity had initially made her marriage to David Brennan seem perfect. David, a commercial loan officer at SunTrust Bank, had appreciated Sarah's ambition and shared her dreams of financial success. They'd bought a 4,500-square-foot house in Kennesaw, complete with a pool and 3-car garage, planning for children who never came, and a prosperity that proved more fragile than either had anticipated. "How's David?" Harold asked, though he already suspected the answer. Sarah's wedding ring had been absent for the past month, and she'd been deflecting questions about her husband with increasing frequency. Sarah's shoulders tensed. "David and we're separated. Have been since June." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke. Harold had suspected as much. Sarah's increased visits, her reluctance to talk about home, the way she seemed to cling to their Tuesday dinners as an anchor in stormy seas. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Do you want to talk about it?" "Not really." Sarah's voice was small, vulnerable in a way that reminded Harold of the 8-year-old who used to crawl into his and Margaret's bed during thunderstorms. "It's just Everything got complicated. The business, the house payments, his expectations. They ate dinner on the screened-in back porch, surrounded by Margaret's carefully planned garden that bloomed in calculated succession from spring through fall. The Confederate jasmine she'd planted along the fence line filled the evening air with its sweet fragrance, competing with the earthy smell of recent rain and the distant aroma of charcoal grills from neighboring yards. Harold watched Sarah pick at her meatloaf, noting how she'd lost weight since her last visit. Her clothes hung looser, and her face had acquired the gaunt look of someone who'd been carrying stress for too long. "Sarah, are you eating enough? Taking care of yourself?" She looked up, and for a moment, her mask slipped completely. Harold saw desperation there, a kind of drowning panic that made his chest tighten with paternal concern. "I'm fine, Dad. Just tired." But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. Harold had built his career on reading structural weaknesses, on identifying points of failure before they became catastrophic. His daughter was showing all the signs of someone approaching a breaking point. As the sun began its descent toward the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Margaret had always called God's evening show, Sarah grew increasingly restless. She checked her phone repeatedly, her leg bouncing with nervous energy as they sat in the wicker chairs Margaret had bought during their 25th anniversary trip to Charleston. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course." Sarah's hands twisted in her lap, and Harold noticed she was wearing her mother's pearl bracelet, something she only did when she needed courage. "Do you ever think about selling the house?" The question wasn't unexpected, but it still hit Harold like a punch to the solar plexus. He'd known this conversation was coming, had sensed it building like pressure behind a dam for months. "This is our home, Sarah. Your mother and I built our life here. You grew up here. But it's so big for just one person. And the maintenance, the property taxes. Dad, you could get at least 400,000 for it in this market. Maybe more. You could buy a nice condo, travel, enjoy your retirement without worrying about upkeep." Harold heard the rehearsed quality in her voice, the careful pitch of someone who'd practiced this speech. But underneath the logical arguments, he detected something else, urgency, desperation even. "Sarah, I'm comfortable here. The house is paid off. My pension and your mother's life insurance cover all my expenses. I don't need to sell. But what if something happens to you? What if you fall down the stairs or have a medical emergency? Who's going to take care of you?" The concern in her voice sounded genuine, but Harold's engineering mind was trained to look beyond surface appearances. Sarah's financial struggles, her separation from David, her increasingly frequent visits, the pattern suggested possibilities he didn't want to consider. "I'm 67, not 97. I'm in good health, I have friends nearby, and I have an excellent relationship with Dr. Martinez. I'm not ready to abandon the life your mother and I built together." Sarah's face flushed, and Harold saw a flash of something that looked almost like anger before she composed herself. "I just worry about you, that's all. Mum's been gone 3 years, and you're still living like she's going to walk through the door any minute." The accusation stung because it contained truth. Harold did maintain Margaret's side of the closet, still bought her favorite Earl Grey tea from the specialty shop downtown, still found himself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning before catching his mistake. But grief, he'd learned, wasn't a problem to be solved with engineering precision. It was a weight to be carried, gradually growing lighter, but never disappearing completely. "Maybe that's how I choose to honor her memory," Harold said quietly. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the porch where Margaret's climbing roses created a natural wall of pink and white blooms. "Dad, I need to tell you something." The tone of her voice made Harold's stomach clench. He'd heard that same inflection when she was 16 and had wrecked the family car, when she was 25 and had been fired from her first real estate job for missing too many client appointments. I'm in trouble. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding her breath and finally had to exhale. Harold felt the world shift slightly, the way it had when Dr. Rodriguez had first used the word cancer in connection with Margaret's diagnosis. What kind of trouble? Sarah's laugh was bitter, lacking any trace of humor. The kind that doesn't have easy solutions, the kind that keeps you awake at night, calculating and recalculating numbers that never add up right. Harold waited, recognizing that Sarah needed to find her own way to the truth. Engineering had taught him patience. Some problems revealed themselves only when you stopped pushing and started listening. David didn't leave because of our marriage problems, Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He left because of what I did, what I've been doing. The confession spilled out like water through a broken dam. The failed real estate investments that Sarah had made using their joint accounts without David's knowledge. The credit cards she'd opened and maxed out trying to cover the losses. The second mortgage on their house that David had discovered only when the bank called about missed payments. How much, Sarah? She turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks in the dying light. $270,000. Maybe more. I stopped counting after I realized I couldn't fix it. Harold felt the number hit him like a physical blow. He'd known Sarah struggled with impulse control, had seen her make questionable decisions with money throughout her adult life. But this level of debt suggested something beyond poor judgment. It suggested desperation so complete that normal moral boundaries had dissolved. The house is in foreclosure, Sarah continued. I've been staying at a hotel for the past 2 weeks because I can't face the neighbors' questions. David's already filed for divorce, and his lawyer is making sure he won't be liable for any of my debts. Harold rose from his chair and moved to embrace his daughter, feeling her body shake with sobs against his chest. This was Sarah at 8 years old, crying about a failed math test. Sarah at 16, devastated by her first breakup. Sarah at 35, weeping at Margaret's funeral. His little girl, now a grown woman whose life had collapsed around her. We'll figure this out, Harold said, though his mind was already calculating the impossibility of the situation. $270,000 was more than his annual pension and Social Security combined. Even liquidating his savings and investments wouldn't cover half of what Sarah owed. Dad, I've already talked to lawyers. Bankruptcy is my only option, but even that won't protect me from some of these debts. And if David's divorce attorney finds out about the money I moved around, I could face criminal charges for fraud. Harold held his daughter tighter, feeling the weight of her desperation and his own growing understanding of why she'd brought up selling the house. His home, their family home, represented the only asset large enough to make a meaningful dent in Sarah's debts. What do you need from me? Harold asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Sarah pulled back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know, I needed you to understand why I've been pushing about the house. It's not because I don't want you to be happy here, it's because I'm drowning and I can't see any other way out. They sat in silence as the last light faded from the Georgia sky, the automatic porch lights clicking on with soft yellow warmth. Harold's mind raced through possibilities, calculations, scenarios. He could refinance the house, take out a home equity loan, liquidate his retirement accounts, but even combining every asset he possessed, he could cover perhaps half of Sarah's debt, leaving both of them financially vulnerable. Let me think about this, Harold said finally. Give me a few days to talk to my financial advisor, maybe the bank. There might be options we haven't considered. Relief flooded Sarah's face, and Harold realized she'd been expecting rejection, had prepared herself for him to turn away from her crisis. The fact that she'd thought him capable of abandoning her in her darkest moment told him how completely her world had collapsed. Dad, I don't deserve your help. What I did to David, the lies I told, the money I stole. Sarah, Harold's voice carried the authority he'd once used to command construction sites. "You're my daughter. You made mistakes, serious ones, but that doesn't change the fact that I love you. We'll find a way through this." Sarah nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. She gathered their dinner dishes with shaking hands, the domestic routine helping to restore some normalcy to the devastating conversation. Harold watched her move through his kitchen, noting details he'd missed before. The way she opened cabinets with familiarity born of countless childhood visits, how she automatically rinsed dishes before putting them in the dishwasher just as Margaret had taught her, the unconscious grace with which she navigated the space that had shaped her early years. When the kitchen was clean, Sarah lingered by the back door, clearly reluctant to leave. Harold understood. Returning to her hotel room meant facing the reality of her situation alone, while staying here provided the illusion of safety and family stability. "I should go," she said, though she made no move toward the door. "You could stay here tonight. Your old room is exactly as you left it." Sarah's smile was watery but genuine. "Thanks, but I have an early meeting tomorrow. A potential listing that might actually sell." She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "Dad, I want you to know that asking you to sell the house, it wasn't just about the money. I've been worried about you, living here alone with all these memories. Sometimes I think grief can become its own kind of prison." Harold considered her words as she gathered her purse and keys. There was wisdom in what Sarah had said, though he suspected her motivations were more complex than simple concern for his well-being. "Drive carefully," Harold said, embracing her one final time. "And Sarah, we're going to figure this out, I promise." After she left, Harold returned to the porch where their conversation had unfolded. The night air carried the sounds of suburbia settling into evening, televisions murmuring through open windows, the distant hum of air conditioners, the occasional car passing on Maple Street. Normal sounds of normal lives, a stark contrast to the upheaval that had just been revealed in his own family. Harold's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for not giving up on me. I love you, Dad." He typed back, "Love you too, sweetheart. Get some rest." But as Harold prepared for bed, reviewing the financial calculations that had been spinning through his mind since Sarah's confession, a troubling thought emerged. The timeline of her crisis didn't quite align with her recent behavior. If she'd been struggling financially for months, if the foreclosure had been pending and David had already left, why had she waited until tonight to tell him? And why now, on the anniversary of his and Margaret's wedding? Harold had spent 4 decades reading blueprints, identifying structural weaknesses before they became critical failures. His daughter's crisis was real, her desperation genuine, but something about tonight felt calculated in a way that made his chest tighten with unease. As he brushed his teeth and changed into his pajamas, Harold tried to dismiss the suspicion. Sarah was in trouble, she'd come to him for help, and he would find a way to provide it. That's what fathers did. They solved problems, they protected their children, they sacrificed their own comfort for their family's welfare. But the nagging doubt remained, a small voice in the back of his mind that whispered about the timing of revelations and the convenient alignment of Sarah's crisis with his own assets. Harold had learned to trust his instincts about structural integrity. Perhaps he should pay equal attention to his instincts about human nature. The last thing Harold remembered before drifting off to sleep was the sound of a car engine starting in his driveway, followed by the distinctive whine of Sarah's Honda Accord pulling away into the Georgia night. Tomorrow, he would begin making the calls, researching the options, finding a way to save his daughter from the consequences of her choices. What Harold didn't know was that Sarah had already decided he wouldn't live to see tomorrow's sunrise. Harold Mitchell should have awakened at 6:30 a.m. to the sound of his alarm clock, followed by his usual routine of coffee, newspaper, and quiet contemplation in Margaret's garden. Instead, he drifted toward consciousness in fragments. First, the sensation of something cool against his cheek, then the distant sound of voices, and finally the gradual realization that the world had shifted in ways his engineering mind struggled to comprehend. But first, the night that preceded this impossible morning had unfolded with lethal precision in the mind of his daughter. Sarah Mitchell Brennan sat in her Honda Accord in the parking lot of the Comfort Inn on South Marietta Parkway, her hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity as she replayed her performance from Harold's porch. The lies had flowed so easily, a skill she'd developed during months of concealing her financial collapse from David, from clients, from herself. The truth was more complex and more damaging than what she'd shared with her father. The gambling addiction that had started innocuously enough with office fantasy football leagues had evolved into something that controlled every aspect of her life. Online poker sites that promised easy money, sports betting apps that turned every game into potential salvation, trips to the Cherokee Casino that began as stress relief and became desperate attempts to win back losses. The $270,000 she'd confessed to Harold represented only her acknowledged debt, the credit cards, the second mortgage, the money she'd borrowed against her real estate license. It didn't include the $40,000 she owed to Tommy Castellano, a soft-spoken man who collected gambling debts for the kind of people who didn't appear in phone directories or report their income to the IRS. Tommy had been patient, even understanding, as Sarah's weekly payment schedule slipped to monthly, then to nothing at all. But patience had limits, and those limits had been communicated to Sarah with gentle clarity 3 weeks ago when she'd found her tires slashed and a note tucked under her windshield wiper. Family can be so precious. Would hate for anything to happen to yours. The message wasn't subtle. Tommy knew about Harold, knew about his comfortable retirement and valuable home. Sarah had until the end of August to produce payment, or the consequences would extend beyond her personal situation. Which brought her to tonight's carefully orchestrated confession. Harold's reaction had been predictable, concerned, loving, determined to find a solution. What he didn't understand was that conventional solutions required time she didn't possess. Bank loans took weeks to process, financial advisors moved at the pace of fiduciary responsibility, and selling a house in the current market could take months. Sarah pulled her phone from her purse, scrolling through the contacts until she found the number she'd hoped never to use. Dr. Marcus Webb answered on the second ring, his voice professionally calm despite the late hour. "Sarah, is everything all right?" Dr. Webb was a psychiatrist Sarah had consulted briefly during her divorce proceedings, seeking medication for anxiety and insomnia that had begun affecting her work performance. What made him particularly valuable was his willingness to prescribe medication with minimal oversight, a quality that had raised ethical questions among his colleagues, but made him popular with patients who preferred privacy over protocol. "Dr. Webb, I need a favor, a prescription for my father. He's been having trouble sleeping since my mother's death, but he's too proud to see a doctor himself." The lie came easily, practiced in the hotel room mirror, until it carried the right note of concerned daughter managing a stubborn parent. "Sarah, you know I can't prescribe medication for someone I haven't examined. It would just be a mild sleep aid. Zolpidem, maybe 10 milligrams, just enough to help him get through the anniversary of my mother's death. Tomorrow would have been their 41st wedding anniversary." The emotional manipulation worked, as Sarah had known it would. "Doctor." Webb had lost his own mother the previous year and understood the complex grief that surrounded significant dates. "I could call in a small prescription to the pharmacy near your father's house, just 7 pills to get him through the difficult period. But Sarah, he really should see his regular physician for ongoing treatment. Of course, this is just to help him over the hump. Sarah ended the call and drove to the 24-hour CVS on Powder Springs Road, where she picked up the prescription bottle containing 7 small white tablets that would solve her problems with brutal efficiency. The plan had crystallized over weeks of desperate calculation. Harold's death, whether natural or induced, would trigger his life insurance policy, a substantial sum that would become available within 30 days. The house could be sold quickly as an estate property, with Sarah as the sole beneficiary managing the transaction. Combined with his savings and investment accounts, Harold's death would generate enough cash to satisfy her debts and provide a fresh start. The moral complexity of murdering her father had been surprisingly easy to rationalize. Harold was 67, alone, still mourning Margaret with an intensity that seemed unhealthy. In many ways, Sarah told herself, she would be ending his suffering while solving her own crisis, a mercy killing disguised as natural causes, with the added benefit of preserving his dignity and their family's reputation. The next evening, Wednesday, exactly 24 hours after her tearful confession, Sarah returned to Harold's house with dinner from Cracker Barrel and a small glass vial containing 3 dissolved Zolpidem tablets mixed with distilled water. Harold greeted her with the same warm embrace as always, though she noticed new lines of worry around his eyes. "I've been making calls all day," he said as they unpacked their dinner. "Talked to my financial advisor, called the bank about refinancing options. We'll find a way to help you, sweetheart." The earnestness in his voice made Sarah's chest tighten with something that might have been guilt, but she pushed the emotion aside. Harold's willingness to sacrifice his financial security for her mistakes only reinforced her rationalization. He loved her enough to give everything, so why shouldn't she spare him the burden of that sacrifice? They ate dinner on the porch as they had the night before, though tonight Harold seemed more animated, energized by the prospect of solving Sarah's crisis through methodical planning and paternal devotion. He outlined refinancing scenarios, discussed liquidating investments, even mentioned the possibility of taking out a reverse mortgage to free up capital while allowing him to remain in the house. "Dad, you don't have to destroy your financial security for my mistakes," Sarah said, the words true despite her intentions. "Sarah, money is just a tool. Family is what matters. Your mother and I worked hard to build security, not for its own sake, but to provide for the people we love. If I can't use that security to help my daughter in her darkest hour, what was the point of building it in the first place?" The sentiment was so perfectly Harold, logical, loving, and completely focused on everyone's welfare except his own. Sarah understood that her father would indeed liquidate everything to save her, would sacrifice his comfort and security without hesitation or resentment, which made what she was about to do feel less like murder and more like preventing his self-destruction. As the sun set and the automatic porch lights illuminated their familiar routine, Sarah excused herself to use the bathroom. In Harold's kitchen, she retrieved his favorite crystal tumbler from the cabinet, the one Margaret had given him for their 20th anniversary, and added 3 fingers of Maker's Mark bourbon. Then, with hands that barely trembled, she added the contents of the glass vial containing enough Zolpidem to put a healthy adult into a deep, likely permanent sleep. "Your evening whiskey," she announced, returning to the porch with the glass that would end her father's life. Harold accepted it with a grateful smile, taking a sip while continuing his discussion of financial strategies. The bitter taste of the medication was masked by the bourbon, though Harold frowned slightly after the second swallow. "This tastes different tonight. Did you switch bottles?" "Same bottle from your liquor cabinet, Dad. The Maker's Mark from the top shelf." Harold nodded, taking another sip while Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. According to her research, zolpidem took effect within 15 to 30 minutes, causing drowsiness, confusion, and eventually unconsciousness. Mixed with alcohol, the effects would be accelerated and intensified. But Harold's tolerance, built over decades of nightly whiskey, proved more resilient than Sarah had calculated. 20 minutes passed, then 30, with Harold showing only mild fatigue. He yawned occasionally, and his speech slowed slightly, but he remained conscious and coherent. Panic began to claw at Sarah's composure. The medication should have taken effect by now, should have sent Harold into the peaceful sleep that would transition seamlessly into death. Instead, he continued talking about refinancing options and family financial planning, oblivious to his daughter's growing desperation. "Dad, you look tired. Maybe you should go inside and get some rest." Harold nodded, attempting to rise from his chair. But the movement triggered the full effect of the drug-alcohol combination, and his legs buckled beneath him. He gripped the armrests of his wicker chair, his face pale with confusion. "I feel strange, dizzy." Sarah moved to his side, ostensibly to help, but actually to assess his condition. Harold's breathing had become shallow and irregular, his pupils dilated despite the porch lighting. The medication was working, just more slowly than she'd anticipated. "Let me help you to bed," Sarah suggested, supporting Harold's weight as he struggled to maintain balance. But Harold's engineer mind, even compromised by pharmaceutical intervention, recognized that something was wrong. "Sarah, I think I need to call Dr. Martinez. This doesn't feel right." The mention of Harold's physician sent ice through Sarah's veins. "Doctor." Martinez would recognize the symptoms of drug interaction, would ask questions about Harold's evening routine, might even request blood tests that would reveal the zolpidem. Her carefully planned mercy killing would become obvious murder. "Dad, let's just get you comfortable first. If you still feel bad in the morning, we'll call Dr. Martinez then." Harold leaned heavily on Sarah's arm as they moved toward the back door, his coordination deteriorating with each step. By the time they reached the threshold, he could barely support his own weight. Sarah guided him back to the porch chair, where he collapsed with labored breathing. Can't stay awake," Harold mumbled, his head lolling against the chair's cushioned back. Sarah checked his pulse, rapid but weakening, exactly as the online medical sites had described. Harold's breathing grew shallow, the pauses between inhalation and exhalation lengthening ominously. His skin took on a greyish pallor in the porch lighting. This was it, the moment of transition from daughter to killer, from desperation to solution. Sarah should have felt relief, or at least resolution. Instead, she experienced something she hadn't anticipated, a profound sense of loss that had nothing to do with inheritance or debt resolution. Harold Mitchell had been a good father, a good man, a person whose only crime was loving his daughter enough to sacrifice everything for her welfare. And that love, that unwavering paternal devotion, was exactly what Sarah was about to extinguish. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered, though Harold was beyond hearing. His breathing had become so shallow it was barely perceptible, his pulse so weak she had to press her fingers firmly against his wrist to detect it. Sarah waited another 10 minutes, timing Harold's increasingly sporadic breaths until they stopped completely. She checked his pulse at his wrist, then his neck, finding nothing. Harold Mitchell appeared to be dead, the victim of what would look like a heart attack brought on by alcohol and stress. The performance that followed was worthy of an Academy Award. Sarah's call to 911, her sobbing explanation that she'd found her father unresponsive on the porch, her frantic attempts at CPR while the dispatcher coached her through the process. The EMTs arrived within 8 minutes, followed by police officers who treated the scene as a routine response to elderly death. Sarah played the part of the grieving daughter flawlessly, distraught but coherent, helpful but not overly controlled. She provided the medical history the coroner needed, explained Harold's recent stress over financial concerns, mentioned his increased drinking since Margaret's death. Every detail supported the narrative of natural death, accelerated by grief and alcohol. By midnight, Harold's body had been removed by the funeral home, the police had completed their cursory investigation, and Sarah was alone in her childhood home with the keys to her financial salvation. What Sarah didn't know was that her father's apparently lifeless body still contained a spark of consciousness, a resilient heartbeat so faint that even medical professionals had missed it. Harold Mitchell wasn't dead. He was in a state of suspended animation so profound that it mimicked death perfectly. And while Sarah began making phone calls to insurance companies and estate attorneys, Harold's unconscious form was being wheeled into the morgue of Wellstar Kennestone Hospital, where a night shift attendant with 40 years of experience was about to make a discovery that would change everything. James Morrison had been preparing bodies for autopsy since 1983, and his practiced hands had detected faint vital signs that modern equipment had missed. 20 minutes after Harold's body arrived at the morgue, Morrison noticed slight chest movement and called for emergency medical intervention. Harold Mitchell's resurrection had begun, though he wouldn't be conscious for another 18 hours. And when he did awaken, it would be in a place his engineering mind could never have calculated, the 18th fairway of Chateau Elan Golf Club, where a friend's morning routine was about to uncover the impossible truth about love, betrayal, and the lengths to which desperate people will go to save themselves. Harold Mitchell's return to consciousness was like climbing through layers of thick, suffocating fog, each level revealing new sensations that his rational mind struggled to process. The first awareness was temperature, cool dampness seeping through his clothes, where his body pressed against grass, still heavy with morning dew. The second was sound, the distinctive hum of electric golf carts in the distance, punctuated by the sharp crack of drivers connecting with golf balls. The third was the impossible reality that he was breathing. His eyes opened to reveal the precisely maintained bent grass of Chateau Elan's 18th fairway, the morning sun casting long shadows from Georgia pines that bordered the course. Harold's engineering mind, despite its chemical suppression, immediately began calculating impossibilities. He'd been dying on his own porch 12 hours ago. Now he lay beside a sand trap 23 miles from his Marietta home, wearing the same clothes but inexplicably alive. The memory fragments began reassembling like pieces of a shattered blueprint, Sarah's trembling hands offering him whiskey, the bitter aftertaste that had made him frown, her whispered apology as consciousness slipped away, the growing certainty in those final moments that his daughter had poisoned him. Jesus Christ, Harold, what the hell are you doing out here? The voice belonged to Bill Chen, Harold's golf partner of 12 years and next-door neighbor. Bill's weathered face showed a mixture of concern and bewilderment as he climbed out of his golf cart, leaving his Callaway driver forgotten on the seat. At 71, Bill moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been shaped by decades of engineering work and weekend golf, but today his movements carried urgency. Harold attempted to sit up, his body protesting with aches that felt like he'd been run over by construction equipment. Every muscle seemed to have cramped simultaneously, and his mouth tasted like he'd been sucking on copper pennies for hours. "Bill?" Harold's voice emerged as a croak, his throat raw as sandpaper. "What time is it? How did I get here?" Bill knelt beside Harold, his trained engineer's eyes quickly assessing the situation. Harold's clothes were damp with dew, but showed no signs of injury. His color was pale but improving, and his eyes, while dilated, were tracking normally. "It's Thursday morning, 10:15. I've been calling you since Tuesday evening, but Sarah said you weren't feeling well." Bill's hands checked Harold's pulse, finding it strong and regular. "Harold, your daughter told me you died. She called yesterday morning, said you'd had a heart attack on your porch." The words hit Harold like a physical blow, confirming his fragmentary memories. Sarah hadn't just tried to kill him. She'd succeeded, or thought she had, which raised the impossible question of how he'd survived and ended up 23 miles from home. "Bill, I need you to listen carefully. Sarah didn't just tell you I was dead, she made me dead. She put something in my whiskey Tuesday night." Bill's expression shifted from concern to alarm, the same look he'd worn 30 years ago when they discovered foundation cracks in a commercial building they'd designed. "Harold, you're not making sense. Maybe you had some kind of episode, got disoriented." "No." Harold struggled to his feet, Bill's steady hand supporting his elbow. "I remember everything, up to the point where I lost consciousness. Sarah needed money, a lot of it. We talked about it Tuesday night. She was desperate, Bill, the kind of desperate that makes people do things they never thought they could." The two men stood on the perfectly groomed fairway, Harold swaying slightly as his circulation normalized. Bill had known Harold for over a decade, had watched him navigate Margaret's illness and death with methodical precision. Harold wasn't prone to paranoid fantasies or attention-seeking behavior. "If what you're saying is true," Bill said slowly, "then someone saved your life and brought you here. The question is who and why they didn't take you to a hospital." Harold looked around the golf course, his engineer's mind automatically cataloguing details. The 18th fairway of Chateau Elan was visible from the Clubhouse restaurant, a popular spot for early breakfast meetings among Atlanta's business community. Whoever had placed him here had chosen a location where he would be found quickly by people who knew him. "We need to go back to my house," Harold said. "I need to see what Sarah's done, what she's told people." Bill pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "Harold, maybe we should call the police first. If Sarah really tried to kill you, with what evidence? My word against hers?" Harold's voice carried the authority he'd once wielded on construction sites. "Bill, think about this from an investigative perspective. I'm supposed to be dead. My body was presumably processed through the medical system. If I suddenly reappear claiming my daughter tried to murder me, what happens? Either they think I'm having a psychotic break, or they believe me and Sarah gets arrested for attempted murder before we understand what really happened." Bill studied his friend's face, reading the determination that had made Harold successful in his engineering career. "What do you want to do?" "I want to understand how I survived. I want to know who moved me here and why. And I want to figure out what Sarah's done in the time she thought I was dead." Harold's voice grew stronger with each word. "But most importantly, I want to do this right. If Sarah crossed a line she can't uncross, she needs to face consequences. But if there are factors we don't understand yet, I need to know them before I destroy my daughter's life." Bill nodded, his methodical engineering mind appreciating Harold's systematic approach. "Okay. But we document everything. Photos, notes, times. If this goes where I think it's going, we'll need ironclad evidence." They drove Harold's spare set of golf clubs back to the pro shop, where Bill signed them out while Harold waited in the passenger seat of Bill's Buick Enclave. The normalcy of the golf course routine felt surreal. Members arriving for their morning rounds, staff preparing for the lunch rush, groundskeepers maintaining the pristine landscaping that made Chateau Elan one of Georgia's premier golf destinations. Harold borrowed Bill's phone to check his voicemail, finding 17 messages that painted a disturbing picture of his supposed demise. Messages from neighbors expressing condolences to Sarah. Messages from his insurance agent asking about claim procedures. Messages from Dr. Martinez's office asking Sarah to call regarding Harold's medical records. "Listen to this one," Harold said, playing a message from Sarah that had been left at 2:30 a.m. Wednesday morning. "Dad, I know you can't hear this, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to do. You were the best father anyone could ask for, and you deserved so much better than this. I hope someday you can forgive me from wherever you are." The message continued with Sarah's sobs, raw and genuine in their desperation. Harold listened to his daughter's anguish, hearing the complex mixture of grief, guilt, and relief that her crisis had been resolved at such a terrible cost. Bill drove them through Marietta's tree-lined streets toward Harold's neighborhood, both men silent as they processed the implications of what they'd discovered. Harold's phone continued buzzing with condolence texts and voicemails, each one reinforcing the reality that his death had been accepted and processed by everyone in his social circle. When they turned onto Maple Street, Harold saw the evidence of his passing in the carefully arranged flowers on his front porch, the vehicles parked in his driveway, and the small group of neighbors gathered on his lawn. Sarah's Honda Accord was parked beside an unfamiliar white sedan, and Harold could see his daughter through the front window, accepting embraces and casseroles from well-meaning friends. "She's playing the part perfectly," Bill observed, parking 3 houses down where they could observe without being seen. Harold watched Sarah interact with their neighbors. Mrs. Chen from next door, the Johnsons from across the street, Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church, where Harold and Margaret had been members for 25 years. Sarah's performance was flawless, the grieving daughter, overwhelmed by the sudden loss of her remaining parent, graciously accepting support while managing the practical details of death. "I need to get inside the house," Harold said. "I need to see what she's removed, what story she's constructed. Harold, if she sees you, she won't. There's a key hidden in the back garden shed. We can enter through the rear door while she's occupied with visitors." They waited until the crowd of mourners had thinned, then circled around through the alley that ran behind the houses on Maple Street. Harold's backyard, with Margaret's carefully planned garden now showing the full bloom of late summer, looked exactly as he'd left it Tuesday evening. The porch where he'd nearly died was clean, showing no signs of the shattered whiskey glass or the drama that had unfolded there. Harold retrieved the spare key from behind the paint cans in his garden shed, noting that the hiding spot remained undisturbed. Either Sarah didn't know about the key, or she hadn't needed it for whatever she'd been doing in his house. They entered through the kitchen door, moving quietly through Harold's home, while Sarah's voice carried from the front porch, where she was accepting condolences. The house felt different, not in any major way, but in subtle details that Harold's engineer mind automatically catalogued. His home office had been searched, though carefully. Financial documents were still organized in their labeled folders, but Harold could tell they'd been examined and photographed. His computer was in sleep mode rather than fully shut down, suggesting someone had been accessing his files. Most telling of all, Harold's desk drawer containing important papers was locked, though he distinctly remembered leaving it open Tuesday evening. "She's been thorough," Bill observed, photographing the office with his phone. "Looking for what, exactly?" Harold was examining his filing cabinet when the answer became clear. Life insurance documents, bank account information, investment portfolios. She needs to understand the full scope of what she's inherited. In Harold's bedroom, they found more subtle signs of intrusion. His closet had been examined, presumably for valuable items. Margaret's jewelry box had been opened and its contents inventoried, though nothing appeared to have been removed. Even Harold's bathroom medicine cabinet showed signs of careful searching. "She's not stealing," Harold realized. "She's cataloging assets for probate. This is what someone does when they're preparing to settle an estate legitimately." Bill photographed everything, while Harold tried to process the psychological complexity of Sarah's actions. She'd murdered him for financial gain, but she was handling his estate with meticulous care and apparent respect for his belongings. The contradiction suggested a level of compartmentalization that disturbed him more than simple greed would have. They were preparing to leave when Harold heard Sarah's voice growing closer, apparently escorting a visitor through the house. Harold and Bill froze in the hallway, listening as Sarah gave what sounded like a tour to someone, probably the funeral director or insurance adjuster. "This was Dad's office," Sarah was saying, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. "He spent hours here, managing his investments and staying in touch with his engineering colleagues. It's exactly as he left it." The tour continued through the house, Sarah pointing out family photographs and sharing carefully edited memories of Harold's life. Her performance was flawless, but Harold could hear something else beneath the grief. Relief. Not just the relief of someone whose financial crisis had been resolved, but the deeper relief of someone who'd crossed a moral boundary and discovered they could live with the consequences. When Sarah and her visitor moved toward the kitchen, Harold and Bill slipped out through the front door, using Harold's neighbor's continued presence as cover. They made it to Bill's car without being seen, but not before Harold had glimpsed his daughter through the kitchen window. Sarah was standing at the sink where Harold had so often stood, looking out at Margaret's garden while talking on her phone. Even from a distance, Harold could see that she looked different, not just physically, though she'd obviously slept better than she had in months, but in her posture and mannerisms. The desperate, hunted quality that had characterized her recent visits was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. "She thinks she's free," Harold said as they drove away from his neighborhood. "Are you going to let her stay that way?" The question hung in the air between them as Bill navigated through Marietta's afternoon traffic. Harold had spent his career solving complex structural problems, finding ways to repair damage and strengthen weaknesses. But engineering solutions didn't apply to murder, and family dynamics operated by different rules than load-bearing calculations. "I need to understand something first," Harold said finally. "Sarah put enough medication in my whiskey to kill me. By all accounts, I should be dead. The fact that I'm sitting in this car means someone intervened, someone with medical knowledge and access to my body after Sarah left me for dead." Bill nodded, following Harold's logic. "Someone who recognized that you weren't actually dead and who had reasons for not taking you straight to a hospital." "Exactly. And that person chose to leave me at the golf course where you would find me, which means they knew about our regular Thursday morning games." The implications were troubling. Harold's resurrection hadn't been accidental. It had been carefully orchestrated by someone who knew both Harold's schedule and his relationship with Bill. Someone who had wanted Harold to wake up with a trusted friend nearby, in a place where they could discuss the situation privately. "Harold," Bill said slowly, "how many people knew about your Thursday golf games?" Harold considered the question. His regular foursome included himself, Bill, Dr. Eduardo Martinez, and rotating fourth players from their retirement community. Dr. Martinez had been their most consistent partner since his own retirement from family practice 6 months earlier. "Dr. Martinez," Harold said, the name carrying the weight of realization. "He would have recognized the symptoms of drug overdose. He would have known I wasn't actually dead. And he would have had access to your body at the hospital, either through professional courtesy or by claiming to be your personal physician." Harold's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Harold, we need to talk. The clubhouse at Chateau Elan, 6 p.m. Come alone. E.M." Bill read the message over Harold's shoulder. "Dr. Martinez, Eduardo Martinez, it has to be." Harold stared at the phone, understanding that his resurrection had been more than medical intervention. It had been a calculated decision by someone who'd wanted to give him choices about how to handle Sarah's betrayal. "What are you going to do?" Harold looked at his watch, 4:30 p.m. In 90 minutes, he would meet with the person who'd saved his life and learn why they'd chosen resurrection over reporting Sarah's crime. The conversation would determine not just his next moves, but the future of his relationship with his daughter and his own understanding of justice, mercy, and the complex obligations of love. "I'm going to listen," Harold said finally, "to Dr. Martinez, to whatever he tells me about Tuesday night. Then I'm going to have the conversation I should have had with Sarah before she decided murder was her best option." As Bill drove them toward Chateau Elan, Harold reflected on the strange gift his daughter's betrayal had given him. For 3 years since Margaret's death, he'd been living in the past, maintaining routines and preserving memories while life continued around him. Sarah's attempt to kill him had forced him back into the present, into active engagement with the complexities of human nature and family dynamics. The irony wasn't lost on him that his daughter's greatest betrayal might also be the catalyst for his return to truly living. The question was whether Harold was prepared for the choices that living, rather than simply existing, would require him to make. At 6 p.m. exactly, Harold Mitchell walked into the Chateau Elan clubhouse to meet the man who'd given him a second chance at life and to begin the process of deciding what to do with it. The Chateau Elan clubhouse at 6 in the evening carried the comfortable atmosphere of successful retirement. Leather chairs occupied by men in golf attire, conversations about handicaps and investment portfolios, the gentle clink of bourbon glasses as shadows lengthened across the 18th green. Harold Mitchell entered this familiar environment as a stranger to his own life, a dead man walking into a world that had already processed his passing. Dr. Eduardo Martinez sat in a corner booth of the clubhouse restaurant, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. At 64, Eduardo had maintained the distinguished bearing that had made him popular with patients during his 4 decades of family practice. But tonight, his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. Harold approached the table with the measured pace of someone entering a negotiation where all parties held dangerous cards. Eduardo looked up as Harold sat down, and Harold saw something in his old friend's eyes that he'd never seen before, guilt mixed with desperate relief. "Harold," Eduardo's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been holding secrets that threatened to crush him. "I wasn't certain you'd come. You saved my life. That deserves at least a conversation." Harold signaled the waitress for coffee, noting how other patrons glanced in his direction with the casual interest of people who didn't know they were looking at a resurrected man. "The question is why you chose resurrection over reporting attempted murder." Eduardo's laugh was bitter, lacking any trace of humor. "Because reporting attempted murder would have meant admitting that I'd falsified a death certificate, manipulated medical evidence, and concealed a crime for 18 hours while I decided what to do with the knowledge that your daughter had tried to kill you." Harold studied his friend's face, reading the complex emotions that Eduardo was struggling to contain. They'd known each other for 15 years, had played golf together most Thursday mornings for the past 6 months since Eduardo's retirement. But Harold realized he'd never seen Eduardo in a genuine crisis, had never witnessed how the man responded when professional ethics collided with personal loyalty. "Tell me what happened Tuesday night." Eduardo's hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth, despite the Georgia evening's lingering heat. "Sarah called me around 11:30. Said she'd found you unresponsive on your porch, that the EMTs were there, but it didn't look good. She asked if I could meet her at the hospital, said you'd mentioned me as your doctor, and she wanted someone familiar with your medical history." Harold nodded, understanding how Sarah had manipulated both the emergency response system and Eduardo's professional concern. "And when you got to the hospital?" "You were already in the morgue." Eduardo's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The EMTs had called it at the scene, apparent cardiac arrest, no response to resuscitation attempts. But Harold, I've been practicing medicine for 40 years. I know the difference between death and profound sedation. Eduardo pulled out his phone, showing Harold photographs he'd taken in the hospital morgue. Harold saw his own apparently lifeless body on a steel table, pale and still, but somehow not carrying the finality that true death would have brought. Your pupils were reactive to light, though barely. Your skin temperature was low, but not consistent with actual death. Most importantly, when I placed my stethoscope directly on your chest and listened for 30 seconds instead of the cursory check the EMTs had performed, I detected a heartbeat. Faint, maybe 12 beats per minute, but present. Harold examined the photographs, seeing himself as Sarah had intended. A problem solved, a debt resolved, a father whose love had been repaid with betrayal. Why didn't you call for medical intervention immediately? Eduardo's expression grew even more troubled. Because of what I found when I examined you more thoroughly. Harold, you had puncture marks on your arm, fresh injection sites that suggested someone had administered medication. And when I ran a preliminary blood analysis, I found massive levels of zolpidem in your system, enough to simulate death in someone your age, especially combined with alcohol. The clinical details painted a picture of calculated murder disguised as natural death. Sarah hadn't simply overdosed Harold with sleeping medication. She'd researched dosages, planned the timing, and prepared for the aftermath with thoroughness that suggested premeditation rather than desperate impulse. Sarah didn't just decide Tuesday night to kill me, Harold said, the realization settling over him like cold water. This was planned, researched. She knew exactly what she was doing. Eduardo nodded grimly. The injection sites suggested she'd practiced the technique, possibly on herself, to test dosage and timing. Harold, your daughter approached this like a medical procedure, not a crime of passion. Harold absorbed this information, understanding that Sarah's tearful confession about her financial crisis had been performance art, a carefully scripted scene designed to establish motive and opportunity while concealing the calculating nature of her actual intentions. So why resurrection instead of reporting? Eduardo was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the golf course where Harold had awakened that morning. Because I knew that once I reported this, there would be no turning back. Sarah would be arrested for attempted murder. Your family would be destroyed. The investigation would expose every detail of your private lives to public scrutiny. And you thought I should have a choice in how to handle it. I thought you deserved the chance to understand what had happened before the legal system made those decisions for you. Eduardo met Harold's eyes directly. Harold, I've known you for 15 years. You're a problem solver, not someone who lets others make important decisions without all the available information. Harold appreciated Eduardo's reasoning, though he understood the ethical complexity of what his friend had done. By concealing Sarah's crime, Eduardo had become an accessory after the fact. By falsifying Harold's death certificate, he'd committed multiple felonies. Eduardo's attempt to preserve Harold's choices had cost Eduardo his own freedom to act legally. What did you tell the hospital? That I'd made an error in my preliminary examination, that you weren't actually dead, but in a profound coma that required specialized treatment. I arranged for you to be transferred to a private medical facility where I could monitor your recovery without generating official records. Eduardo pulled out a manila folder containing medical charts and documentation. You were unconscious for 16 hours while the medication cleared your system. I monitored your vital signs, administered supportive care, and waited for you to regain consciousness naturally. Harold reviewed the medical records, seeing the careful documentation of his resurrection. Eduardo had essentially operated a private intensive care unit, maintaining Harold's life while concealing his survival from everyone, including Sarah. Why the golf course? Eduardo's smile was wan, but genuine. Because I knew Bill would find you there, and I knew you'd need a trusted friend when you woke up. I also knew you'd want to investigate the situation before making decisions about Sarah's future. The planning was elegant, Harold admitted. Eduardo had orchestrated Harold's return to consciousness in a way that provided maximum support while preserving Harold's autonomy. But the consequences of Eduardo's choices extended far beyond Harold's immediate situation. Eduardo, you've destroyed your career to give me options I'm not sure I wanted. Perhaps. But Harold, I watched you nearly die from grief after Margaret's passing. I've seen you spend 3 years existing rather than living, maintaining routines rather than engaging with life. When I realized Sarah had tried to kill you, I also realized she'd given you something you hadn't been able to find on your own. Which was a reason to fight. A reason to engage fully with the world again, even if that engagement involved confronting the worst betrayal imaginable. Harold considered Eduardo's words, understanding that his friend's intervention had been motivated by more than medical ethics or personal loyalty. Eduardo had recognized that Harold's resurrection could be either a return to his previous pattern of existing in Margaret's shadow, or a catalyst for genuine re-engagement with the complexities and challenges of being fully alive. What happens now? Eduardo opened his briefcase, removing a sealed envelope that he placed on the table between them. That's up to you. In that envelope is a complete medical report documenting Sarah's attempted murder, including blood analysis, photographs, and my sworn statement as a witness. If you decide to pursue criminal charges, everything you need is there. Harold stared at the envelope, understanding that it contained the power to destroy his daughter's life while potentially restoring his own sense of justice. And if I don't? Then Sarah continues believing she's gotten away with murder, and you live with the knowledge of what she was willing to do for money. Eduardo's voice carried no judgment, only the weight of presenting difficult options. Harold, there's no right answer here, only consequences you'll have to live with either way. Harold's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. Dad, I miss you so much. I know you can't see this, but I wanted you to know I'm handling everything just like you would have wanted. I love you. The message arrived like a ghost reaching across the boundary between life and death. Sarah's continued performance of grief, even when she believed no audience was watching. Harold showed the message to Eduardo, who read it with the expression of someone witnessing something profoundly disturbing. She's not just maintaining a facade for other people, Eduardo observed. She's convinced herself that what she did was somehow an act of love. Harold understood the psychological complexity Eduardo was identifying. Sarah had rationalized patricide as mercy, had transformed murder into an act of filial devotion. The depth of her self-deception suggested damage that went beyond financial desperation into genuine psychological fracture. I need to talk to her, Harold said finally, face to face. I need to understand who my daughter really is before I decide what to do with this information. Eduardo nodded, though his expression showed concern. Harold, if Sarah realizes you're alive, if she understands that her plan failed, she might try again, or worse, she might hurt herself. Then I'll have to be very careful about how I approach this conversation. Harold pocketed the envelope containing the evidence of Sarah's betrayal, feeling its weight as both weapon and burden. Eduardo had given him the power to seek justice or grant mercy, but the decision would define not just Sarah's future, but Harold's own character in the years remaining to him. As they prepared to leave the clubhouse, Harold realized that his resurrection had taught him something Margaret's death had not, that love and betrayal weren't opposites, but could coexist in the same relationship, in the same heart, in the same impossible moment when a daughter hands her father a poisoned glass and whispers goodbye. Tomorrow, Harold Mitchell would have the most important conversation of his second life. Tonight, he would decide whether that conversation would be about justice, mercy, or the complex space between them where families sometimes found ways to survive the unsurvivable. The question was whether Harold had the wisdom to choose correctly and the strength to live with whatever choice he made. 6 months later, Harold Mitchell stood in the visiting room of Pulaski State Prison, waiting for his daughter to appear behind the reinforced glass that separated them from physical contact, but couldn't diminish the complex bond that tied them together, despite everything that had happened. Sarah entered wearing the standard-issue jumpsuit of someone serving a 15-year sentence for attempted murder and elder abuse. The weight she'd lost during her financial crisis had been replaced by the lean muscle of someone who'd found purpose in the prison's educational programs. Her eyes, when they met Harold's through the glass, carried a clarity that had been absent during those final desperate months before she'd tried to kill him. "Hi, Dad." Sarah's voice came through the intercom system, electronically filtered but unmistakably his daughter. "Hello, sweetheart." Harold settled into the plastic chair, noting how Sarah's posture had changed. The hunted desperation was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. "How are you doing?" Sarah's laugh contained genuine humor for the first time in years. "Better than I have any right to be, considering. The irony isn't lost on me that it took trying to murder you to finally get my life together." The conversation that had led to this moment had taken place 8 months ago in Harold's living room, with Sarah believing she was speaking to her father's ghost. Harold had concealed his survival for 3 weeks while observing Sarah's behavior, watching her manage his estate with meticulous care while maintaining her performance of grief for friends and neighbors. When Harold finally revealed himself, walking into his own house while Sarah was meeting with his insurance adjuster, her reaction had been everything Eduardo had feared. Complete psychological breakdown, followed by a suicide attempt that had required hospitalization and eventually led to psychiatric evaluation that revealed the depth of her gambling addiction and the complex trauma that had driven her to attempted patricide. The legal resolution had been surprisingly straightforward. Sarah's confession, combined with Eduardo's medical evidence and Harold's testimony, had resulted in a plea bargain that acknowledged both the severity of her crime and the psychiatric factors that had contributed to it. Harold's decision to support Sarah's rehabilitation rather than seeking maximum punishment had influenced the sentencing, though it hadn't eliminated the consequences of her choices. "I got your letter about the new program," Harold said, referring to Sarah's recent acceptance into a prison-based addiction counseling certification program. "I'm proud of you for taking on that kind of responsibility." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained steady. "Dad, I know this sounds impossible to believe, but trying to kill you saved my life. Not just because it stopped me from gambling. I'd tried to quit before and always failed. But because it forced me to confront who I'd become, what I was capable of." Harold had heard variations of this sentiment in their monthly visits, Sarah's gradual articulation of how attempted murder had paradoxically become the catalyst for genuine self-examination and recovery. The psychological complexity still troubled him, but he'd learned to separate Sarah's growth from the trauma of her betrayal. "Tell me about the counseling work." Sarah's face animated with enthusiasm that reminded Harold of the daughter who'd once stayed up all night perfecting science fair projects. "We're working with women whose addictions led them to hurt their families. Dad, There are so many of us. Mothers who stole from their children's college funds, daughters who manipulated elderly parents, wives who destroyed their marriages chasing the fantasy of easy money. Harold listened as Sarah described the peer counseling program she'd helped develop, using her own experience of rock-bottom betrayal to help other women understand the progression from desperate to dangerous. The work gave Sarah purpose and allowed her to transform the worst chapter of her life into something that served others facing similar crossroads. "How do you explain to them what you did to me?" Harold asked, genuinely curious about how Sarah had learned to articulate the inarticulate. "I tell them that addiction doesn't just change your behavior, it changes your identity. For 2 years, I wasn't Sarah Mitchell Brennan, daughter of Harold and Margaret Mitchell. I was a gambling addict who happened to share that person's memories and relationships." Sarah paused, collecting her thoughts. "I tell them that the person who poisoned you was a stranger wearing my face, and that recovery means learning to be myself again instead of the addiction." Harold appreciated Sarah's framework for understanding her transformation, though he'd never be able to fully separate the daughter he'd raised from the woman who'd whispered goodbye while handing him a lethal dose of medication. Some betrayals created permanent changes in relationships, even when forgiveness was genuine and recovery was complete. Their conversation continued for the full hour allowed by prison regulations, covering Sarah's educational progress, her plans for eventual reintegration into society, and her gradually developing understanding of the damage she'd caused beyond Harold's near-death experience. The ripple effects had touched everyone in their extended social circle: friends who'd questioned their own judgment about Sarah, neighbors who'd felt betrayed by her performance of grief, colleagues who'd struggled to reconcile the Sarah they'd known with the Sarah who'd committed attempted murder. As visiting time concluded, Sarah pressed her hand against the glass separating them. Harold matched the gesture, their palms aligned but unable to touch, a perfect metaphor for their relationship's current state. "Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask this, but do you think you'll ever be able to trust me again?" Harold considered the question, understanding that Sarah needed honest assessment rather than comfortable reassurance. "Sarah, trust isn't something that gets restored. It's something that gets rebuilt from scratch. What you're doing now, the work you're putting in, the person you're becoming, that's the foundation for whatever relationship we might have when you're released. And if the foundation isn't strong enough, then we'll know that too. But Sarah, the fact that you're asking the right questions, doing the hard work, facing the reality of what you did, that tells me the daughter I raised is still in there, still fighting to become someone worthy of the love your mother and I always had for you." Harold left Pulaski State Prison and drove back to his new condominium near Chateau Elan Golf Club, where the view from his kitchen window showed the 18th green where he'd awakened to his second life. The small space felt more like home than the Marietta house had in the 3 years since Margaret's death, partly because he'd chosen it actively rather than inheriting it from his previous existence, but mostly because it represented his decision to engage fully with the present rather than merely maintaining the past. Eduardo Martinez was waiting in the clubhouse when Harold arrived for their weekly Thursday game, which had continued despite Eduardo's loss of his medical license and Harold's complicated resurrection. Dr. Martinez looked up as Harold approached their usual table, his expression carrying the mixture of guilt and relief that had characterized their friendship since that night in the hospital morgue. "How is she?" Eduardo asked, knowing Harold had spent the afternoon visiting Sarah. "Getting better, doing the work, still my daughter despite everything." Harold signaled the waitress for his usual coffee, noting how the routine comforted him in ways he hadn't expected. "Eduardo, I never properly thanked you for giving me the choice about how to handle Sarah's situation." Eduardo's smile was rueful, but genuine. Harold, we both know my intervention was as much about my own need to feel useful as it was about preserving your autonomy. Retirement from medicine is harder than I expected. The loss of purpose, the sense that your most important work is behind you. Harold understood Eduardo's sentiment, having experienced his own version of purposelessness during the years following Margaret's death. What are you going to do now? I've been accepted into a program that trains retired medical professionals to provide volunteer services in underserved communities. Turns out there are plenty of places that need doctors who are more interested in helping people than protecting their licenses. Harold appreciated the symmetry. Both he and Eduardo had found ways to transform the trauma of Sarah's betrayal into renewed engagement with meaningful work. Harold's own second life had included joining the Cobb County Literacy Program, teaching adult education classes to people whose circumstances had prevented them from completing their formal schooling earlier in life. As they prepared for their golf game, Harold reflected on the strange gift Sarah's attempted murder had given him. In trying to end his life, she'd forced him to examine what kind of life was worth living. In choosing to betray the person who loved her most, she taught him about the resilience of love, even in the face of ultimate betrayal. Harold's handicap had improved significantly since his resurrection. Not because his physical skills had changed, but because he'd learned to play golf the way he now approached life, with full engagement in each shot, rather than distracted attention to past failures or future concerns. On the 18th tee, the spot where Bill Chen had found him awakening from supposed death 8 months earlier, Harold lined up his drive with the confidence of someone who'd learned that second chances were gifts to be used rather than preserved. His ball sailed straight down the fairway Harold had once awakened upon, a perfect metaphor for the clarity that had emerged from chaos. Harold Mitchell had discovered that resurrection wasn't just about coming back from the dead, it was about choosing to truly live after years of merely surviving loss. As they walked toward their golf balls, Harold's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, thank you for seeing me today. Thank you for not giving up on the person I can still become. I love you." Harold smiled, typing back, "Love you too, sweetheart. Keep doing the work." Yeesh, the message represented everything complex and hopeful about their relationship. Love that persisted despite betrayal, forgiveness that coexisted with consequences, and the hard-earned wisdom that sometimes the greatest act of love is allowing someone to face the full weight of their choices while continuing to believe in their capacity for growth. Harold Mitchell had learned that the second life was defined not by the dramatic moment of resurrection, but by the daily choice to engage fully with the world's beauty and pain, to love completely despite the risk of ultimate betrayal, and to find meaning in the complex space between justice and mercy, where families sometimes learn to survive the unsurvivable. The Georgia sun climbed higher over the pines, promising a beautiful day for golf and for whatever second chances the future might hold.